This workshop will be mainly focused on how to communicate, and it uses a metaphor of peaches and coconuts, which we'll learn about more soon. And I wanted to mention that this workshop will be recorded, but only for the educational parts. Any part where anyone is sharing, we will stop recording. And with that, I'd like to welcome Claudia.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for letting me be here today. I'm looking forward to sharing space with you all. First thing I want to say is I apologize. There is going to be a little bit of background noise. I do have children and a very, very loud partner in the background, which is fun. So I'm sorry, but let's go ahead and get started. So again, my name is Claudia Pena, pronouns she, hers. I am the coordinator for student activities at Muir College. And trying to think about that. Just a brief thing about myself. If we have any people that are from the Coachella Valley and from the Coachella Valley originally, I went to UCSD as undergrad. I also did my master's at San Diego State, and I'm currently doing my doctorate with UCSD and San Marcos. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background of who I am, so hopefully get to know you all in the near future. And let's see, so where to get started? I want to share my screen, but before I do that, give me 1 second. Sorry. Okay, so let's see. I am going to put a quiz link in the actual chat. And I know, some might find it fun, some might not. But I just ask that you participate in the quiz, and the way that you can do it, so it's a Google Doc that has a series of questions, and answer it to the best of your ability. If you want to open up a piece of paper and write it down, so number it, choose your answer, or you can open up a document and then record your responses too. However you prefer. The thing is, there is a number associated with whatever answer you choose. So if you choose A for this, it'll say like 1 or 2. What you're going to do is add them up, and then you're going to get a number at the end of it. So here's the quiz. I'm going to give folks 5 minutes. It probably will take less, but I'm going to let people pace themselves. And when you are done, if you can actually use the feature, the hand raise feature, I think if you click participants, you can go ahead and raise your hand in the feature, so that I know that you're finished. Introduce myself and kind of shared a little bit about myself. So go ahead and move to the next slide. So just to kind of go over what is going to happen today, like I mentioned, we did the quiz already. We're going to talk about fruit, and then communication. Sorry, I think I broke up over there, froze. We're going to do breakout rooms, and then we're do a quick debrief. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, cool. All right, so I shared the link. We did the quiz. So here are the results. So if you scored between 10 and 15, you are a peach. And I'll describe that in a bit. If you scored between 15 to 20, you are a coconut. Can I ask, just for people, oops, sorry, went the wrong way. What do you all think that means? Can I ask for all right, so if you identify as a peach, you may appear to be soft and smooth on the outside. They do not have too many problems with strangers because everyone seems like a potential friend. They are open to all and everything. They are flexible and relaxed. But do not forget that peaches have a stone in the center. So don't mistake that the message for the peach that they do not have this, or they do have this stone that protects their intimacy and their inner world. So they are friendly and open, but it doesn't mean that they're open completely to you. Now let's talk about the coconut. So like Jacqueline, what you said, have a hard shell exterior. The coconut has an outer shell that protects their intimacy. These coconut cultures distinguish clearly between public and private spheres of their life. Regarding their houses, they are rarely open to strangers, and for peaches, they might seem, cold or distant and possibly even unfriendly. They need their personal space, and sometimes it takes time for somebody to get to know them. And then once a person does break through that hard shell, they're loyal, and may even consider friends their chosen family, or even family in general. So overall, I just kind of want to make some notes or say a few things. This is not a scientific quiz. This doesn't mean, even if you scored a certain way, you could have identified as a peach, but you think you're more of a coconut. I just want you to, keep an open mind about, what we discussed today. If you identify with one fruit more than the other, doesn't mean that you don't have characteristics of the other fruit. And I also, just to give a little critique about this whole theory, the peach and the coconut, there's a lot of fruit out there. It's not just the two fruit, it's not a binary. So I want y'all to understand that this is just a way that getting the point across, and why I brought this up in regards to communication and overall. So also, one fruit is not better than the other fruit. Just want to make that clear. So why are we talking about fruit? Claudia, I thought this is about communication. Why are you talking to me about coconuts and peaches? But I just kind of want to bring up, we just went over the differences between these two fruits, right? And how these different fruits or people interact to communicate with other people, or like people. So these fruits are actually people, right? Doesn't mean that their form of communication is wrong, just because it's a different way that they prefer to communicate. We just need to take a moment to recognize our preferred form of communication isn't the only way. So some takeaways of, some takeaways from today. What is communication? Recognizing people have different ways of communicating. Tips on how to respond to different forms of communication too. So we'll go into a little bit more detail. So defining communication. A process by which information is exchanged between individuals through common systems of symbols, signs, or behavior. And I think it's just kind of important to know what that definition is. Like, I think a lot of people assume that communicating is, okay, you like verbal, you have to be, that's the only form of communication. But I just want to point out, obviously, there's different forms, and I know you all know that, but I think when we're talking about in this presentation, we're not just talking about verbal communication, we're talking about different parts or different ways that people communicate. So kind of diving a little deeper, verbal communication, obviously, using your voice. Non-verbal communication, smile, eye contact, or maybe not smiling and not not making eye contact could also be considered non-verbal communication. Visual, so like motions with your hands, pictures, etc., or written, so using words and writing. And I want to put this up in front of everybody, and also just like kind of name this. I'm doing this presentation on communication, but like I think one of my biggest fears is giving presentations, and I just don't, like, my preferred form of communication isn't necessarily verbal, but here I am doing it. And so I think in general, everybody has their different types or preferred methods of communication. And for a peach, I think the example was used as or the question that was asked in the quiz is, they might be a little bit more friendlier or talkative and verbal when it comes to just people and interacting with strangers. And a coconut isn't, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be with their preferred method of verbal or communication. It's just the way they interact with people in general. So difference in communication. Again, we'll dive a little bit deeper of style of communication is different across, people and cultures. Peaches communicate different than coconut. We kind of went over that of a way that peaches could communicate with folks that they don't know, or just people in general, and the way that coconuts communicate with other folks. So in this theory of the peach and coconut, they use this a lot for cross-cultural communication, or how different cultures communicate with one another. I think one of the biggest examples was people from Latin America might communicate peaches more than somebody from Germany. And I gotta say, I don't know how I feel about that comparison either, because then my next point is that even if people across different cultures communicate differently, maybe Latin American people might identify more like peaches and German folks might identify more like coconut. There are so many differences within each culture as well. that it's important to note that too. And obviously, I think we definitely need to highlight that there are a lot of difference in culture. Like, differences, good, we shouldn't ignore that. But there's also like the differences in the pockets between like every culture as well. So again, obviously, when you're raised in a different location, you have different ways or preferred methods of communication. And again, there's reasons why I bring all of this up. And we'll kind of go into that in the next slides, but I kind of just want to again point out how the importance of the fact that even if it's a different culture, there's also differences within that culture. And then also awareness of person's ability. Sometimes, considering the fact that there's folks that might not be able to speak or hear or see, and that also might change the way that they communicate or prefer to communicate. So why is this important? Overall, it's important to understand that we live in a world with a lot of different peaches and coconuts and fruits, and sometimes we don't always see eye to eye. And it might not even be that like you all don't get along, or not necessarily like, it's not an issue of liking one another. It's just the way that folks communicate. And there's a common misunderstanding of like, we don't communicate the same way, but that's the start of it all. And sometimes when we have that first impression where we think something of somebody else, that kind of creates that you create that understanding of a person. It's not necessarily the way that they are completely, because we haven't gotten past that initial first interaction or gotten to that point where we understand the way that they communicate. So I think sometimes what is appropriate, I'm a little nervous, so I'm a little rambly right now. I apologize. Just to kind of go back, sometimes we just need to take a step back and take a look at, think about, how another person might actually communicate with one, might not be communicating how you are communicating. So I think it's just taking that moment to think about it before you start making those assumptions about somebody and thinking, oh, they're just not a friendly person. But really, they're a coconut. They're just a little bit harder to break through. So we'll go in a little bit more of like some tips and like maybe some things to keep in mind while communicating with other folks in general. Not even thinking about culture or anything like that, just people, knowing that people are not always the same or prefer or not always communicate in the same ways. So sometimes what is appropriate in one's culture may not be something we recognize in our own. It doesn't mean that anyone is wrong. It's just the way that it's how it is, it's what's familiar to them. And I think in general, some things that I can point out too, and I should have probably pointed out before, an example is like, the way I was raised, I'm identify as Mexican American, is very different from what my partner was raised, but he's also Mexican American. So the way that we communicate is way different. He's a hard coconut for sure, but I'm definitely a peach. And so it's really interesting to point out like the way that his, even though we come from the same culture, we definitely have a lot of differences within the culture, and sometimes what he communicates, the way he communicates isn't necessarily something that I recognize, especially, first getting to know him as a person. So it's, again, that taking a moment to take a step back and being patient with other people to really understand where they're coming from, and possibly just giving them a moment to express themselves in the way that they're comfortable, so that you can also accept, what they're saying or like their forms of communication. And again, another thing that I want you to consider of like why this is important is consider your roles like in your life, whatever that might be. A student, I use my example just because I want to speak for myself. I'm an educator, mother, wife, sister, daughter, student. I think thinking of all those roles, there are so many people I come across and so many people I interact with. And I think in every way that I interact with other folks, I definitely, I can't communicate with everybody in the same way that I would communicate with my son, my 4-year-old son. So really just taking a moment to think about the people that I'll come in contact and really adapting to ways that I'm going to interact and communicate with others in that role. So again, as an educator, I meet with students all the time. And I think right now it's a little different because it's a virtual world and our form of communication is on Zoom. And that's not everybody's preferred method of communication. But I think that's also another, taking it a little bit further, is we don't always have to do a Zoom call, you know. I know that right now that's kind of in because that's kind of like our automatic response is to do a Zoom meeting. But learning to adapt and be open to other forms of communication. Like if you want to do a phone call, cool. Unfortunately, we can't really do in-person communication, but, or let's chat over email or text message or Slack, whatever way that people would prefer to communicate. So really just thinking about and asking those questions to people that you interact with in whatever role or capacity you're working with others, and maybe even people you're not even familiar with working with on a daily basis, asking them, what is your preferred method of communication? And let's do that. And I think it's that kind of give and take. You know, you want to work with other people and be open to working with other people. And, you know, hopefully, you know, as they see, you know, that you're willing to give some time and be flexible and adapt to, you know, their forms of communication, they will, you know, give back. All right. So some tips, and I've kind of already touched on this a lot. Importance of being patient when communicating with people in general, strangers, or even people you're familiar with. Kind of going back to that whole peach example, we talked about how peaches are very soft on the outside and, like, you know, can come across as very friendly at the beginning. So it's easy to talk to them at the start, but then they have that center, right? That hard center where, like, when you reach that point, it's harder to break through. You know, it's harder to get into that intimate spot almost, or like just like getting to know deeper, like a deeper them. So I think that's why I kind of point out of like, be patient with people that even if you're familiar with them and like, let's say they are a peach, they might reach a point where they're not willing to open up a little bit further. So I think in general, just again, being open-minded, but also like patient with the fact that there's people that just don't communicate the same way across the board, even if you know them or are familiar with who they are or like thought you did. And then strangers, again, I think this is more important than anything. Obviously, like we don't know what we don't know this person, right? You don't know what they're going through either, and that definitely impacts the way that they communicate. So just keeping that open mind of like when you do interact with a stranger, um, like, you know, not necessarily asking like automatically off the bat, like, what's your form of communication, right? I think that takes time, but at the same time, you could, you know, you could ask that, but also just understanding that some people don't want to small talk, like they don't want to engage in any small talk, and that's fine. Um, and then another point is folks that you work with. You might be working with somebody um, for a long period of time, but still barely getting to know them. And I think that's really important to kind of establish those getting to know you things of like, let's talk about your preferred method of communication. Wow. And then, you know, hopefully that will start with like, you know, a healthy relationship. And same thing with like the form of communication throughout the process might be a little bit more simple, just because you know how one wants to communicate, and even just like how much they want to talk about work, how much they would prefer, you know, to talk about, you know, personal things and like, you know, things like that. So again, being patient and adapting to forms of communication, I think is key, just because obviously I know, like, I'm not saying to change yourself, but again, keeping that open mind and adapting to other folks' communication patterns and things like that is important in order to like keep on having for or is important to continue a relationship with other people. And then another key point, so consider the sender's receiver communication efforts and consider the way of communicate in a manner that is best accepted by the sender or receiver. So again, kind of like what I said, asking, preferred methods of communication is a good way to get to know somebody, but also consider the way that you communicate. Like if you're super, talkative and, all about being open to, being open to getting people involved in like personal life and sharing about your personal life, the other person might not be interested in giving that part of themselves to like somebody else, like opening up to that information. So just understanding that there's other ways, or understanding that there's a limit for people to want to communicate that stuff, or just keep it plain professional. Actively listening and then responding. And I think this also kind of goes back to, obviously there's different cultures and just like people that communicate differently than we do. So I think we tend to often not really listen to what a person is saying. And we start formulating, opinions and things like that, and not necessarily actively listening to the person. And when that happens, sometimes we just misinterpret what somebody means, what somebody is saying, because we jump and assume, and that causes a lot of chaos sometimes. You make assumptions that this is what this person meant, but in reality, sometimes when we if you are like bilingual or like speak multiple languages, and sometimes when you're trying to translate that information, the way that it comes out, like the way that you translate it into English might not sound the same, especially as like a person's learning that, as like what you're used to. So when it comes out, it might sound, with a different tone or like a different understanding that you're used to. And so I think we're quick to hear things and then not necessarily actually know what they're saying. So listening before you actually respond, and actively listening, hearing them out through before you start formulating those responses. And I believe it's in the next slide too. So I'll jump over to that. Again, check meanings. So hearing what a person might say, and don't assume you understand what they mean. So like a way to also, like, let's say you're actively listening to somebody and you think, oh wait, that's odd. Like, am I hearing that correctly? How about like, repeating it in your own words? Like, I'm trying to hear what you're saying, or like, I hear that you're saying, X, Y, and Z. Am I hearing that right? Because sometimes that also might clear up what that person is actually intending to say, versus like what they're actually saying. And I think that also kind of clears up a lot of mixed communication, or like sometimes, again, those misinterpretations too. So, and I kind of also want to highlight that it's not necessarily, because I think the way that we approach that whole repetition thing, it's not in a way to be condescending or say that like, hey, like I can speak better than you can. No, it's more of a, I'm trying to understand what you're trying to say and I'm having trouble understanding. So this is what I'm hearing. Can you help me like understand that? Again, be supportive. And that's interesting to say, because I think a lot of people, like being supportive, and what I mean when I say that is, I think sometimes when folks are in a place where they have to communicate or kind of forced to communicate in a way that they're not comfortable with, they're timid and they're scared, and honestly just kind of being their biggest fan and saying like, yeah, like, you're doing a great job, because I think we're always learning, we're always trying to better ourselves, and not being a supportive coworker, friend, and kind of poking fun at the way that they communicate could be pretty harmful to a person. So remember, be their biggest fan, say like, you're doing a great job. And even if that means like saying like, I still like need help understanding, but remember to, formulate that you're not coming at them in a way of like a negative way of saying like, oh, actually you should have said, X, Y, and Z better. Again, that whole thing of being condescending or like, I know better than you, but more like, I'm trying to understand you and you are doing a really great job, with what you're saying. But, I am trying to understand what you're trying to get or what you are saying to get your point across. And right now I'm struggling with that too. Okay, so I said earlier, obviously, I think, there are many differences. Even if you identify as a peach, you might have some tendencies like, or some things that you might relate to more like, with coconut. And I think you kind of said it right now, Sergio, of like, you kind of have to have that signal of comfort. You're not necessarily automatically going to be like completely friendly to a stranger unless like you have some kind of signal that they're open to that communication. So I think in general, also, I want you to take away that there's no fruit that's better than the other. And again, why do we have to have just the peaches and the coconut? Like, I want to know what a banana's like. What are the characteristics of a banana or apple? And so I kind of want to show you this clip that's actually from my Big Fat Greek wedding, because there's a message that kind of to what I'm getting to. We communicate differently. We're all, we have a lot of differences. And I'll just, I'll play the video for y'all. And I'm sorry, my background is messy. I feel like the equivalent to a messy room nowadays is your back screen, right? Okay. Can you all see that? Yeesh. Uh-oh. Let me know if you can hear it, if I can get a thumbs up. Wait, can you hear?
There's no audio.
Okay. You know what? I'm actually gonna see if I can stop it.
I'm going to marry Ian Miller. That the root of the word Miller is a Greek word. And Miller comes from the Greek word Milo, which is mean apple. So there you go. As many of you know, our name Portokalos has come from the Greek word portokali, which means orange. So, okay, here tonight we have apple and orange. We all different, but in the end, we all fruit.
So I wanted to share that. I mean, I know, again, it's not coconut and peaches, but I guess like, if you've seen that movie, it's kind of about, that traditional, Greek family and this woman marrying, outside of that Greek person that her family wants to marry. And I think the reason why I brought it, that scene specifically is because it's that point in time where they're finally learning how to communicate with one another. And now they're coming together to be, a family, and now they're getting along. And I think in general, yeah, it's a movie. That's not always the case in real life. I know that. But we all have different ways of communicating, right? And I think it's just that big takeaway of learning to find that patience with somebody, that compassion with another person, or like, having compassion for other people and patience with other people and supporting other people no matter how they communicate. Because I think that's really important. We all have different ways, not even just different ways, we have our ups and downs, and that affects our communication too. So I think it's important to just recognize those things, so that we begin to have a little bit more flexibility with other people. And I hope you all have learned something here today. I was very nervous and I second guessed myself a lot, so my communication is like all over the place when that happens. But I just want to say thank you for sharing space with me today and allowing me to be here, and I hope you took something away. So thank you, everybody.